You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
In cases of crime and violence, the focus is often on the justice system and how perpetrators are punished. Dr. Umbreit describes how his work is more victim-centric. You mentioned that restorative justice is victim-centric. Does it happen often that an offender will ask to meet with the family of a victim and apologize or want to have a dialogue with them? Or is it generally driven by the victim's family, the outreach to an offender?
That's a really good question because, again, looking at the main 95% or more of restorative justice cases, common crime, property crimes, burglary, thefts, vandalism, minor assaults, those come through the courts, and many times offenders ask for that, not always. And those are essentially offender-initiated because they're coming through the courts. So typically, in preparation, the facilitator or mediator will go out and meet the offender first to check out their story. Are they really willing to proceed? You don't force them into it. This is voluntary. And most people will meet with the offender first so they don't meet with the victim and get their expectations up, and then you go back and meet with the offender and say, they don't want to go with it. So that's very common at that level. On the other hand, with severe violence, it's shifting it totally, as I mentioned earlier. Those are victim-initiated. Sometimes offenders do want to express apology. I've worked with cases like that. That's precisely why the Minnesota Department of Corrections has set up an apology letter bank, where it's fine for offenders to have the impulse to want to apologize or meet with the victim, but not until the victim expresses interest. They might write an apology letter and it's put in a bank. The Department of Corrections keeps that, so that if the victim survivors ever indicate on the website they would be open to receiving a letter from the offender, they can so do that. Being victim-centered does not mean you're not concerned about showing respect and assistance to offenders too. It just means you start with the reality of victimization. Our criminal justice systems are totally offender-driven. It's a trail 'em, nail 'em, jail 'em, next case. 95, probably 99% of funding goes for all of the offender stuff. And a lot of that's understandable, but precious little goes for providing services for victims in general, let alone restorative services to respond to victims of severe violence who really request the need for their sense. You know, this stuff is not about, this is not the old paradigm. This is not about offender rehabilitation or just purely victim assistance and, being angry and vengeful to the offender. It's plowing new territory. Some people who are not aware of how the RJ movement has been out here since the mid-70s might say, well, this sounds all interesting, but where's the research? There's more empirical data to validate the core effectiveness of restorative justice dialogue, specifically victim-offender mediation, in terms of restitution completion, recidivism reduction, victim satisfaction, sense of fairness, than there is for many, if not most, of our conventional criminal justice interventions, which we spend billions of taxpayers' dollars. I want to be real clear on this. Restorative justice is not a cure-all for all crime, but particularly at this point in our nation's history, where all states are stressed, this is the time to seize the moment to look at very practical business plans, not just proposals, to how can so many hundreds or thousands of low to mid-level offenders that currently go into the expensive criminal justice system, sometimes even in prisons, how can they go through other forms of accountability that also have healing for victims and communities at a fraction of the cost? How can those business plans be developed? This is where our European colleagues have leapfrogged us decades ago. They have implemented restorative justice legislation in their nations. The European Union, back in 2001, required member states to have in their national legislation procedures for victim-offender mediation and dialogue.
A lot of media attention is focused on initial conflict, acts of violence, war. We don't often see how communities rebuild themselves after the violence. In your work, what is the healing process like for war-torn communities? And when does the healing process fail and regress back into violence?
Peace agreements are absolutely necessary to stop the violence. That's track one diplomacy. That's the John Kerrys, the Hillary Clintons, and their counterparts all over the world. Peace agreements have to be made. But without track 2 and track 3 diplomacy, which is more what I'm involved in, they can be meaningless. They're only on paper. They're false pieces. They look good to the media. They look good to politicians. And there's no connection. There's no groundedness in the community. That's what happened to some extent with the Oslo Agreement, when Yasser Arafat came together, with the Israelis and worked out that incredible agreement. That's happened in other locations. So track 1 diplomacy, just having the high-level politicians and policymakers make agreements, without track 2, people-to-people diplomacy, building social capital. Without that, that can oftentimes be meaningless. Truth and reconciliation processes, like in South Africa and many, many other countries over the years, in Liberia, extremely important. And part of the Liberian experience was having a truth and reconciliation process in the diaspora, the community here in Minnesota and other parts of the States, that was held at Hamline University several years ago. They were the first to do this, to have it not only in their own country, but here in another country. All of that's important. But I want to be real clear, this is not some kumbaya moment. This is not some quick fix. This is messy, messy stuff. It can take generations. For example, in Northern Ireland, when the Good Friday Agreement was negotiated finally under the Clinton administration, part of the supporting documents were restorative justice documents. And even though the level of violence is fairly low level, it still flares up. The level of conflict still in communities, when I go there and visit and work with people, it's huge. It'll take generations for that to pass through. And that's why they're trying to find and utilize different forms of restorative dialogue, where people can sit down together, not see eye to eye, but simply be in the same room and talk about the suffering, where they can break bread together, where, quote, the energy of the conflict can shift. I hope you can get a sense of what I mean by this energy stuff. I mean, this is like the emotional energy stuff. But this is something palpable. You can feel it. And frankly, thousands of mediators today, even in conventional mediation, know what I'm talking about. Even in some of the most legalistic kind of mediations and facilitations, there oftentimes are these aha moments. Why are these people interacting the way they are at this point?
Professor Mark Umbreit, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That's all for this edition of Access Minnesota. Next month, we'll continue our conversation with Professor Mark Umbreit and hear how the Center for Restorative Justice and Peacemaking is helping victims of trauma. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.